on B.
Porter Halyburton, take 3, soft sticks.
Wow, there's so many places I want to go here. You've touched on the powerful effect and the ways in which the senior leadership helped bond you guys together, helped just transform your experience. And by the way, Porter, your description of living in the future, bemoaning the past, and then finally arriving at your community and your brotherhood and your present is so beautiful. I mean, it's actually mystical. But let's touch on for a moment the role of the senior leadership and how was it? Talk to me about the leadership, the things that stood out for you. And if you would, touch on some of the object lessons that were passed down, like back US and things like that.
Right. Well, I guess, in the Navy, sometimes you say you got to get there early to get the good deals. And I sort of thought about that because I got there pretty early. And one of the good deals was that I had the chance to talk fairly directly to these 3 guys, to Denton, Stockdale, and Reisner. Not to speak, I could speak directly to Stockdale because we were in Heartbreak Hotel at the same time. He was in the cell next to me. And he told all of us that were there, I think there were 7 of us in Heartbreak at the time when he was brought in. And we were the first Americans he'd had any contact with, even though he'd been shot down for a month. And he told us his entire experience during that time and said, I may not make it, but you younger guys, you are not injured. If you get home, I want you to be able to tell my family and Navy what happened to me. And so in the course of the time, the couple of weeks that I spent in that situation with him next door, we had the time to talk when the guards were not there. And so he passed on, his sort of assessment of our situation and so on, and saw right from the beginning what an incredible human being he was and how smart he was. And he was in terrible shape. He did not think he would make it at that time. His shoulder was broken, his knee was broken. He had, just terrible condition. But even in that condition, he still assumed, his position of leadership, and he remained the senior naval officer throughout our whole experience. And then I moved from Heartbreak and to several different places, but one of them was beside Jerry Denton. And Jerry was from my ship, from the Independence. And I remembered, of course, when he and Bill Schutte were shot down in their A6. And so I was the first person from the Independence that he had talked to, and we were tapping through the wall. And so I was able to give him news, particularly one of his very good friends who had been killed. I was on the mission where he was killed, and bring him up to speed on things that had happened and all of that. And then to be able to, listen to his take on what our position was and what we needed to do and all of that. And then in yet another situation, I was able to talk to Robbie Reisner, who was outside, and I passed along to him a lot of information, and he, I don't remember exactly what he said then. But then once the Vietnamese realized that they had these senior people amidst the rest of us, and that they were going to exert leadership, then they began to keep them isolated. And so the various sort of bits of guidance and all of that would come then from, through several different comm links and so on. And so all this about second line of resistance and all of that, came through from them, but through several different comm links. So I didn't have any direct contact with any of these guys from that point on. And of course, they were tortured far more than the rest of us, or certainly me, because they had extracted, I guess what they thought they wanted from us. But they continued to torture Stockdale and Denton Reisner in order to break them as leaders, because they knew how powerful that was. They knew that they needed to keep us as separate and as isolated as possible, because that's the way you can indoctrinate someone, is to keep them isolated and away from any other stimulation or information or anything. That's the first thing you do in brainwashing, is you separate the subject from all forms of information, stimulation, or anything. So you are absolutely and completely alone and in their control. And it's many against one. And you know that in a situation where you have no stimulation, you're not hearing anything, you're not seeing anything, you're not feeling anything, you become hungry for stimulation. And of course, a brainwasher, indoctrinator knows that. And so that's the condition they want you in. And so that's why they went to such extreme measures to keep us as isolated as they could. That's why the punishments for communicating, even making noise in your cell, were severe, because they knew that we were clever. They knew about the tap code probably from the beginning. They knew that we were trying to communicate they found notes, they knew all these things. And so they tried mightily to prevent us from doing it, because they knew that once we broke out of that isolation, then it's harder to convince people of what you want to convince them. And I think of it as an illustration of the fasci. You can take a small stick, a pencil, and you can break it very easily. But if you take a whole wad of them and bind them together real tightly, there's no way you can break that. It's the whole idea behind fascism. The fasci was a Roman symbol, a bundle of sticks tightly bound together. And the whole idea was, in fascism, everything is bound together. Society, arts, education, government, military, everything is bound together. But it all comes from the Roman fasci, which was a symbol of a Roman military commander, that his duty was to bind his unit together tightly. Because a phalanx, if one person fails, it's an opening and it can fail. And then the little hatchet sticking out meant that commander had the power of life and death over his commander. So I found the fasci a very interesting kind of visual explanation of what we had to try and do, was to bind all of us together. And what our senior leaders were trying to do was to bind us all together in a common patriotism, sense of duty, honor, And I think that's why, our watchword became you return with honor. Not just return, but return with honor.
I'm sorry, sir. Do you have anything on that?
I'm gonna text Sarah. Grab this.
It's so stunning when
I'm
you're,
gonna have her find you out there.
what color's on these?
Like 10 minutes.
Okay. Is you gonna come back in the door, or can I go on?
You go on.
Okay. Let's go to return with honor. When was the first time you had that tap through the walls? Do you remember the first time you?
I don't remember when I first heard that, but I know that it became a part of our lives, at a certain point. And I have a feeling it was probably after Sante.
Excuse me. Okay, sorry.
Sante occurred after the treatment had changed. They realized that torturing us, for information anyway, was not working. And that, National League of Families and CORE and Ross Perot and all this publicity, the POW bracelets and, all of this was getting them some pretty bad press. And that I think they felt like the anti-war movement could be split over the question of treatment of us. And so they realized that they didn't want that. Their whole objective in having us and using us and torturing us and mistreating us and humiliating us was to force us to participate in some way in the anti-war movement, because that's how they felt like they were going to eventually win. They were they were willing to pay a high price for that. We didn't understand that. That's one of the reasons that we failed, is we failed to understand our enemy and to understand the extent with which at least the government, the leadership, was willing to sacrifice their people. We lost 58,000 people killed in the war, and they lost between 2 and 3 million. We had 2,500 KIA. They had 300,000 KIA. And so we had no understanding of the extent that they were willing to sacrifice in order to not lose. And they knew that if they could influence American public opinion, that the war was wrong, was unwinnable, was illegal, was immoral, it was against American principles, all of those things. If they could convince enough Americans of that, then we'd have to leave. That's a short history of the war right there, because that's what happened, because we realized we could not win militarily in any fashion that would produce a good result, because we also had to win politically, and there's where the real failure was. So this whole idea of I was back to the Sante raid. They realized that what they had been doing was not productive, so they quit torturing us. They let people write and receive letters and receive packages, put us in larger groups, and slacked up on some of the regulations and so on. And eventually a bunch of us moved out to a new prison, the only prison they built specifically for us. And compared to everything else, it was a pretty nice place. And then they were doing this larger groups sort of step by step, letting groups to get together. and putting us more in a compound situation where during the day you could get out during this compound. So it was pretty good compared to before. And then the Sante raid happened about 10 miles away. And of course they panicked over that and they moved everybody back into Hanoi, and that's when we moved into the large cells in the Hanoi Hilton that had previously been filled with Vietnamese prisoners. And so they moved the Vietnamese prisoners out to our prison and moved us in. And so all of a sudden we're in groups of 40 or 50. And they hadn't planned for that. And so that's when we had, everybody was there. And so we had camp-wide, prison-wide communication. And the seniors got together. By this time, you know, there were some Air Force full colonels who actually outranked Robbie Reisner. And so that's when, you know, things got really organized and we began to get these sort of directives and what were called plums and so on. And so that's how it kind of codified a lot of this sort of wisdom that we had been living with for quite a few years. Didn't really need it, but I guess it had to be sort of codified, and we were actually required to memorize these plums, which I did not do.
What did you learn about your fellow human being in your time in the prison systems?
Well, you know, we learned that it's very difficult to judge the true character of a person based on what you think you might really understand about that person. That somebody that you think is fairly insignificant may turn out to be very significant. And somebody that you would predict is going to be an outstanding leader is a complete failure. And I saw that on both extremes, you know, guys that you wouldn't think would be the kind of people that they were. Like Bob Purcell, you know, he's a prime example. He probably had Article 15s in his record, you know, he was a hellraiser, he drank too much, he flew his airplane inappropriately, too low, too fast, you know, all of these things. But he also had a lot of letters of commendation in his record as well. And he was very unconventional. But he turned out to be, at least among the mid-level, you know, I mean, he was just an Air Force captain. Might have been passed over for major, I don't know. But he turned out to be one of the most exceptional leaders that I've ever met in many, many ways. And on the other end, we had people that went astray. You know, we had the Magnificent Seven. You know, we had people that made mistakes. Most of them realized that eventually, you know, came back into the fold, were reinstated in the chain of command and so on. But there were two who did not, and they were true traitors. And they were senior officers, a Navy commander, a Marine Corps lieutenant colonel. And if you looked at their records, the Marine was the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Corps, had a sterling record, as did the Navy commander. You never would have guessed that they would fail in the way that they did. And what terrifies me is the thought that maybe these two guys had been shot down when Reisner and Stockdale were. And Stockdale and Reisner never arrived. How different our experience would have been to have people who caved in immediately, did every bad thing you can imagine, even turning in their own fellow Americans to the North Vietnamese, resulting in torture, mistreatment, everything, giving top secret information to the enemy. Who would have thought these two senior guys? You would think, okay, some wet behind the ears ensign or second lieutenant, who didn't know any better would be the one that was convinced by their propaganda. But it wasn't, it was these two guys. And the guy who was the most junior guy there, Doug Hedgel, Seaman Doug Hedgel, was one of the staunchest patriots that you could imagine and did more good for our cause, than most anybody. So it's really hard to judge what a person is going to do under extreme pressure.
I'm so glad you said that, because Doug Hager was the one that came to my mind.
Yeah.
We can break now.
Is it time for
If
it?
you're okay with it.
I think we'll take a little break, get some lunch, and
Sure.
and I want to make sure that I pace this well. And Carrie, if you could help on the hook, maybe go ahead and cut the camera.
You want to just leave the wire? I'll
Yeah.
just stick that part in my pocket or whatever.
Yeah, perfect.
Great.
Because I know Patrick would like to